So let's go ahead and get going. We're going to do an introduction to the client object model. What is it? How does it work? How can you use it? And then we're going to look at the 3 different ways that you can interact with the client object model, starting with stuff you can do in your .NET assemblies within your projects. And then we're going to look at some stuff you can do in Silverlight. It's a slightly different implementation in Silverlight. Do you know if there's less or more functionality, or is it the same in the Silverlight?
I think it's slightly less.
Is it slightly less? Okay.
Yeah.
And then we're going to look at how you can do this stuff in JavaScript as well. So if you're doing a bunch of Ajax stuff and whatnot, you can interact with the client object model via JavaScript, which is really kind of cool. So these colors are awful. You can hardly see that. So this is just an overview of looking at data in SharePoint and how it works. The key point to understand here is that the client object model is actually running via a web service to transfer data. Now, you don't see that. You're not making a web service call like you did previously and invoking a service reference and doing a service call. It's running on the back end when you instantiate your methods, and there's some specific ways to interact with that service and some ways you need to design your code to make it effective and performant. So that web service that runs in the background actually handles all 3 of the different types: Silverlight, .NET, and JavaScript in talking to SharePoint. And it's really just backending through the SharePoint API at the end of the day, but there is a limited subset of functionality in the client OM. So the problems, some of the challenges we've had in the past, obviously, a lot of people have done web services programming. You know it was difficult, a bunch of XML going back and forth, right? Authentication was a problem. There were just lots of challenges. You end up creating a lot of your own wrapper methods and services to get to some of the stuff that isn't exposed. It was, again, a limited subset, although pretty robust. There was a lot of stuff you could do with the web services in 2007, but it was difficult to interact with them with JavaScript and do Ajax-y stuff, and so it was a holdover approach from 2003 that worked fairly well. But now that we've got WCF and REST and some of the other protocols and things we're using, it was just time to update it, make it easier to write client applications. Here's the 3 different types and how they work with the SharePoint data, where you can do CRUD operations, the same typical stuff that you're doing in the SharePoint object model on a smaller scale can be done through the services. Bear in mind that you have the same or similar type of performance implications that you had in 2007 in working with the web services. There is an HTTP request being created that goes and talks to that web service, right? You're pulling data down the wire over your front-end servers, right? So unlike code that's running native compiled in your application, you're actually having to make a request call to go and get that. So you need to bear that in mind. If you're making heavy use or doing a lot of data on these applications, it might make sense to scale out your server farm for that, or to dedicate boxes specifically to servicing your data requests, because it can put a fairly heavy load. If you think about accessing a list that has 10,000 or 50,000 items in it, that can put a fairly heavy load on the front-end servers to transfer all that data, which is the same connections that your users are using to actually browse the site. This is just a visualization of kind of how it works. You've got your client service running, you've got your JavaScript controls from the browser or your managed OM from the client. They're making an XML request out to the service, and they're getting a JSON response back that you then process. So anybody done JSON stuff in Ajax and JavaScript and all that? Okay, so same sort of stuff. You should be familiar with how to handle all that stuff when you're doing the browser-based piece of it in JavaScript. And actually, a lot of the methods and the syntax is pretty similar. So you can switch pretty easily between the Silverlight and .NET and JavaScript stuff, because it's pretty consistent. A little bit of a change in the naming convention when you're working with things. You can mostly just drop the SP off the front of your various SharePoint objects that you're used to using. So SP context becomes client context. Then you have site, web, list, list item field, list collection, list item collection, those sort of things. And you just drop the SP off the front. The most important thing of all these is the client context. In order to, just like when we're working in server-side code and we go spcontext.current, right, and current web and all that sort of stuff that we use, we have to assign a context to what we're working with, and we have to pass in a URL so that we know what site the context is that we're working from, right? So all of your methods and calls are going to start with setting up a client context first, so you can then start to interact with the data that you're retrieving. That's a bunch of stuff. What does it all mean? Well, who knows? But they're pretty boxes, right? Just a hierarchy. This is the same stuff, really, that's on the server-side object model, so there's no real big difference in what you're doing. Everything flows up and down the way that it traditionally does in the server object model. So they put a lot of effort into making sure that it was consistent. So if you've done server-side programming, when you switch over to the client OM, it won't be that big of a difference other than learning how to manage the call request and response pipeline to make it as performant as possible.
And remembering to drop the SP from
And remembering to drop the SP. Right. So here's the client context piece. You're always going to start with client context. One of the things that you'll have to get used to is calling these load statements. So what this is actually saying is I'm going to set up my client context. So this is the site that I'm working with. And then I've got to load that into the request. So it's saying I'm going to do a query, which is down here, which is execute query. And this is from only the .NET client object model has sync processing. When you're doing it from Silverlight or from JavaScript, it's all async, right? So you're doing the load complete stuff in there. But in the client object model, you can do it here from .NET. You can do execute query, and it's sync, and it comes right back, and then you can work with it. But only those objects that you define in the load event are going to be available to you to work with, right? So if you go and set up, I want a web, and I want a list, and I want a list item collection, and I want to get all these items, and you forget to put them into load statements, they're not going to come back in memory for you to work with, right? So put them in your load statements. That way you've got a list object you can now work with. Then when you execute the query, this is where the communication with the server happens. So you'll see when we do the demo code that you do some setup, and then you do an execute query to go talk to the server and get your stuff and bring it back, right? And you may do multiple ones of these depending on the context of what it is you're trying to work with, right? So for example, when a list comes back, you don't have access to the list item collection to work with, right? You just got a list object with all of its fields and parameters. So you have to do an execute to get your list, and then you can go say, okay, now I want the list item collection. Let me load that up and make a query to get that. And there you can do some batching of stuff to make it a little bit easier. Handling of commands. So this is sort of the sequence that it goes through. So you set your commands, you execute the query, it goes to the server, right? Then the server processes it, sends it back to you in the JSON response. I'm doing all the talking. Is there anything you want to say?
No. You carry on. I'm going to be doing coding later.
Yeah, right. So you do need to worry about the sync and async processing that's happening, right? So in your .NET code specifically, if you're doing sync operations, you got to realize there's going to be a delay while that query executes and then comes back, unlike the async stuff where you can continue processing until you get the async response back. So bear that in mind when you're doing your processing. I think can you do the async stuff with the .NET? Is it in there? I think it is.
I think it is.
Yeah. So if you want to do but that's the only one that has sync.
Yeah.
So you have to bear that in mind about how you're managing that. One thing that's missing to you is elevation of privilege, right? So you have to be, the user that's making that request has to have the right permissions. You can't do run with elevated privileges when you're doing client object model.
And the reverse of that is obviously that means all of your requests are in the context of the current user. So any security that you've got set on those list items, that'll be enforced in the client OM just as it would be on the server.
All of your requests are throttled, just like pretty much everything else in 2010. So throttling applies to those. If you try and execute some big fat, 10,000 item query and throttling is turned on, it's going to say, no, I don't think so. And also bear in mind that there's HTTP request throttling in 2010 that administrators can set in central admin for the farm, for the web application. So there may be throttling happening that you're not aware of when your code is executing. So you're building out these methods, you think, why is it taking so long for this process to execute? Why am I not getting my data back? It's failing, whatever. It may be that the throttling is shutting you down. So you need to be aware, especially when you move from dev to production, because we never throttle anything in dev. When you move into production, that your administrators who didn't listen to you when you said turn all that stuff off because it messes up my code's more important than your silly farm, that they may be throttling that stuff. So you need to have some communication with them to say, hey, what kind of stuff is going on? You need to be aware of those parameters when you move the code into production. Right. Okay, .NET Client OM. So this is typical, SharePoint development. When you're working with anything through the object model, you're typically working in, say, a WinForm application or something of that nature, or it could be a separate web application somewhere, and you're writing assemblies to talk to SharePoint. So it's just your typical SharePoint dev. You need two assemblies in order to work with it: Microsoft.SharePoint.client and client runtime. They're relatively small, right, in comparison to the nicely optimized and minimized SharePoint DLL. So they load very quickly. This is especially important when you're doing JavaScript stuff, right, and you have to call sp.js, and it has to load all that stuff up in the background. So quite a bit better from that perspective. I would argue that 281 and 145 together is still pretty large for a request, but it's better than doing the SharePoint DLL. So let's look at how this actually works. I'm going to do a little code. I'm going to switch over here into Visual Studio. So what I've got is, I've just got a SharePoint site that has a list, and it has, 100 items in it or whatever it has in it. And so what I want to do is I want to take this very simple basic list, and I want to put it into a WinForms application and make a request via the WinForms app to go and get the data. So I've got a pretty basic form here, and it's just a typical WinForm, and I've got a grid view on it, so I'm going to bind this stuff to the grid view when I get it, so I can display it here in the client app. So pretty simple setup behind. I've got some helper methods to just build a data table so that I could populate it with what comes back. So let's start working with the client code. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to get our client context. Not constants, context. Ooh, this should be fun. Eric can't type today. We could end up with some interesting code. No promises that it will compile. All right, so I'm going to set up a URL, right? So this is just local one here on my demo box, right? 95, right? So there I'm going to pass in a URL to set up my client context. And I'm going to say I need a web object, so my website here, and I'll do context.web. So everything happens within context of the context. So anytime you're calling these objects, they're deriving from that context that you've created. And now I need to get this object back in memory so I can work with it, right? And here's where this tripped me up the first couple times I did it, so you'll want to keep an eye when it starts throwing errors saying, hey, I can't get to this collection or whatnot. I need to make sure that I do load, so that when I make the query, it comes back with my web object, right? So now when I execute the query and it returns, it'll have that item in memory. But as I said, you can batch these. You don't have to do them one at a time, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a list. Notice it's a list, not an SP list, not to be confused with a generic list or the 80,000 other types of lists that we have to work with. Web.lists. Right, and get, whoa, what happened there? There we are. Crazy typing. All right, get. So you'll notice that some of the methods that you're used to working with are missing, right? So when I go to do a web, I get a list. I've got get by ID and get by title, right? So I can say, okay, that's cool. I want to get by title, and I'm going to pass in my list name, whoops. So widgets. It's going to be a long afternoon. All right. Now, typically, I could do things here like just get data table, right? If I was in the SharePoint object model, then I could get my data table back and I'd be done. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist here, right? There's no get data table, right? So if you're taking code that's out of the SharePoint, sorry for the folks on the left, this monitor's in the way. If you're taking code that you're porting over from the SharePoint Server API, there's going to be a fair amount of refactoring that you have to do for the methods that are missing. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do instead, and I'll show you these helper methods here in a second, is I'm just going to go ahead and just populate a data table object with what's coming back from the list. Unfortunately, that does have performance ramifications, right? If I've got a large amount of data and I have to get it back and then I have to go populate another object, right, and go row by row through the list item collection and get that, that can have performance implications. So bear that in mind if you're working with large data sets. So now that I've done this, I can say load my list. Okay, now I've got 2 items that I want to get back in memory. I want to get my web object and I want to get my list object. So let's go ahead and do an execute query. So at this point, it will actually step out and make the request to SharePoint and create execute. I think I can do execute, no async. Check it out.
Fair enough.
Nice. No async in the .NET portion, sorry. All right, so what's going to happen now is that it's going to go out and make its request, and it's going to return me 2 objects that I can work with, the web and the list. Once I've done that, I now need to get my list items in my list item collection, right? So the easiest way to do that is just with a quick camel query. So I'm going to do a camel query. Notice this is not SP query, it's camel query. So a little bit of a difference there. Camel query equal new camel query. Right, we're going to set that up, and then I'll give it some view XML, right? And this is a very long and complicated camel query. Don't try this at home, very difficult. Bang. Just give me everything. Now once I've got that, I can get my list item collection. So my list item collection, list items. So this is pretty similar to how we do it on the server side. We say list.get items. Get items, right, and pass in the camel query. Right? Bang, done. Now that I've done that, right, in order to have access to that list item collection, what do I need to do? Load it. That's it. CTX load, right, list items, and execute the query. Execute query. Boom. Okay. So now I've made 2 requests to get my data, right? So you can see as your code gets more complicated, you can start generating a fair amount of traffic to the server and making multiple requests to load up objects, right? So this takes some iterative working through and performance testing to make sure that this stuff is working the way you want it to and not putting too much of a load on the server. So now I'm going to take my table, and I've just got a little helper method down here that just says, hey, go and insert data rows into the table. So take each list item, right, and put it into the table, which does require iteration of the list item collection. There's some memory footprint there that happens. We're doing it in memory, so it's not as bad. But if you're doing like a JavaScript request, right, it's going to be sitting there spinning while it goes through and iterates through all those items and returns it. Whether or not this is common for the type of applications that you're writing, if you're going to be doing a lot of data fetching, that just depends on what the requirements are. So once I've got that and I've inserted the rows into the data table, as you can see down here, so I'm just taking the columns from the view, inserting them into the data table, which is one good reason for doing a camel query instead of the whole list item collection, because if you get the whole list item collection and all the fields, then you're going to end up with all those funky fields that SharePoint puts in there, which is a whole bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily need. I'm going to do a binding source. This is a data grid, not a grid view, so I'm going to do a binding source, bind it to the table, right, and then generate it. So assuming that the code is correct and I can compile it, odds are 50-50. We'll see if today's a good day. All right. So here's my form. I can hit retrieve items. This fires the event handler on the button that goes out and starts executing my stuff. There it is. So it comes back to us in a grid view, right? And I've got all of my items with only the columns that I had come back from the view, right? So fairly simple example, but it gives you an idea of the stuff that you're going to be doing in the .NET side of the client object model. So we'll return to where we were. All right, very good. And I'll let you do Silverlight.
I get to talk. Fantastic.
Yeah, about time.
Yeah, good stuff. Right, so Silverlight is pretty similar to using the .NET stuff as well, but it's a completely different set of DLLs. The key thing about Silverlight deployments is there's now a clean way of deploying Silverlight out of the box without having to mess around in your web.config files, without having to worry about where you're deploying stuff to. You've got a client bin out of the box in layouts, so obviously features and solutions can deploy your ZAP files to that. or you can just stick them in document libraries, and that works out of the box. So there are, it's really difficult to read.
Yeah, that's hard to read. Blame Steve for making us use these colors.
Yeah, rubbish colors. Right, so there are basically 3 different ways that you can interact with data using Silverlight. We're talking today about the client object model, and that has a great use case around building quickly, building applications with knowledge that your data's secure and going to be used in the right way. But there are other ways of using it, right? The web service layer that's out of the box, you can go ahead and connect your service references up in the same way that you could with any other WCF service. And you've also got the REST API. So that enables you to use RESTful interfaces to communicate with the data and make use of that data and edit and change that data. I guess each to their own. Some people will find the application that they happen to be developing at that time, it makes sense to use REST. Other times, the client object model gives them a lot more power and flexibility. So, helpfully, there are 2 completely different client OM DLLs. They're a similar size to the ones we saw just before, and they get automatically redistributed as part of your ZAP. So you don't need to worry about your users getting access to these things. If they've got Silverlight on their client, they'll be able to use that. They're also in a different place. So the ones that we looked at before were in the server extensions /14/iZappy. These ones are in the client bin that comes out of the box. It's important to, when you're referencing the client OM DLLs, it's important to reference the right one if you're in a Silverlight project. Things get very weird if you try and use the wrong. But the code is pretty similar. You're going to create a client context. You're going to do some stuff on that. You're going to load that in, and then you're going to execute query. But in this case, we're doing it asynchronously. And I'll go through a demo a bit like Eric's one on that. In terms of deployment, it takes full advantage of the new tools in 2010, in Visual Studio 2010. And in particular, you can deploy sandboxed applications. So you get very clean F5 deployment, and it's a very, very nice way of using it. There are a couple of things that you need to be aware of. If you're not deploying through if you're not creating a Silverlight application for a SharePoint server, where it's actually going to be hosted on a different server or a different URL, you've got your traditional client access policy issues that you need to resolve. So anyone who's done any Silverlight development will know that trying to access resources in a different domain, that's going to be hard unless you've got, well, impossible unless you've got client access security policy defined. So I'll show you how to define that and where to define that too. So let's have a look. That one?
Yep.
Magic. Right, so what we've got here is just an out-of-the-box team site. This is got a presentations document library with a bunch of files in it. The files aren't really that important. What I'll be doing is creating a Silverlight application that can consume those. So let's have a look at my basic setup. The first thing to note is in my virtual directory bin, I've got a client access policy file here. So if we have a look at that, it's pretty straightforward. I wouldn't recommend deploying this to a production farm. It sort of leaves it a bit wide open. So when you're thinking about how you're going to deploy your Silverlight application, you need to be thinking about who's going to be accessing it, from what domain, and how they're going to be accessing it, and what assets you want to give access to. So, for example, giving complete open access to and grants to any resource anywhere in your URL, that's probably a bad thing. So you need to think through some of the processes of governance and how you lock this down in a good way. Okay, so
Ben, can we include that in our Visual Studio solution?
no.
No, it has to be done manually?
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are ways of doing it. You can package it into a feature and deploy that to layouts or somewhere like that, and then have a feature receiver that goes off and pushes that file to the right place in the right farm. That's what you had to do in 2007. That story hasn't changed substantially in 2010. The other way of doing it is if you're automating everything through PowerShell, which you probably ought to be doing, a PowerShell command to do that is pretty straightforward. It's going to be something like copy item from your source to your destination. So there's a number of options, but you do need to think about how you're going to deploy that, because it's not something that you can do through markup in your features and your
So that's a good example of, we talked yesterday if when we were doing the custom deployment, how we've got pre and post deployment commands that we can include in our deployment configurations.
Right.
And those are good places where you can use PowerShell as part of your deployment to copy those resources out. That doesn't solve your production problem. You still got to find a way to get it into it in production, but at least in dev you can just wire up that script, let it go do its thing. That way all your policies and stuff remain in your solution and in source control.
That's right. Okay, so I'm going to just create a new Silverlight application. I'm not going to use the Visual Studio extensions for the 2010 tools for SharePoint, because this is an example of a completely standalone Silverlight application that's going to consume information but doesn't have to live on the same server that I'm developing on. So the first thing what I've got here is a Silverlight project and then a web project that's going to host that for debugging purposes. So the first thing I need to do is add references to the right place. So there's a number of places where we might look for that. iZappy was the one that we looked at before, but these are not the client DLLs that you're looking for. You've got to move along. You've actually got to go to Template, Layouts, Client Bin, and there they are. And you do need to add both of them. Okay, so we've got our references set up. Next thing is we probably want to make this a bit prettier, but not much, because I'm not a designer. So I'm just going to drag a...
We don't do pretty, do we, devs?
No. Definitely not. Okay, so I'm just going to drag a text box on there. And I'm not going to... I'll give it some... so I'll give it some basic text. Should I put a background color on it?
Huh? Why?
Nah.
That's for designers.
It's for designers.
Nice.
Absolutely. Right, okay, so in the code behind for this, now in the real world you'd be wanting to implement the MVVM pattern to separate your business logic from your rendering logic. You'd want to be doing a lot of that stuff that's going to help automated testing, which will make the system more robust. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to do all the code in my code behind, sort of ASP.NET version 1 style, as you do. Right, so I'm going to add a reference. I've got the same problem as you.
You've got an excuse.
I know, I've got a sprained wrist. So, Microsoft.SharePoint client. So very simply, we've added that reference in. So now we've got access to the client context. So client context. So it's pretty similar to the demo we just saw. So context dot so new. Now in this case, if we knew this application was running on the SharePoint server locally that we want to consume the data from, we can use client context dot current. So that saves that makes it more deployable. Because we're not doing that, we'd probably make the URL that it's going to point at be a property. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to create a new context. I'm going to go to my website, and there's my context. So from that, I want to get my web object. And in this case, I just want to, I don't need any information from this web, so I'm not going to load it. But I'm going to use it to get other information. So if I look at if I get the list item collection for, actually, no, I'll make that a property.
Listening.
Okay, so I've got something I've got a property I can refer to later. Right, so next thing I need to do is go and get that list data. So list item. I'm going to rename that because that's a really bad name. Web.lists.getByTitle. And the list that I'm going to get is called presentations. I'm also not in the root web, so that's not going to be good either. So client OM demo. Right. So I'm going to get the presentations list. So that's a list. Right, so there's my list. The next thing I need to do is I need to do a query on that. So in the same way as we saw before, we'll write a camel query. And I'm going to be just as adventurous as... Actually, no, I'm not. I'll be a bit more adventurous. I'll put a row limit in.
Ooh, careful now.
Straight from the script. What could possibly go wrong? Right, so there's my camel. Wait for IntelliSense to catch up. That looks all right. No, it doesn't. New camel query. So put that in the view data, and we're good to go. So my list item data field I can now populate with my presentations list dot get items with the camel query I've just created. So there we go. Now this is a piece of information I do want to load into my context, because I want this information to come back. And then away we go. We can then execute that asynchronously. Now interestingly, the object model does have execute query, but we don't think that's supported.
It doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So, hopefully by the time we get side of the RTM code, that will have quietly gone away.
You think?
No.
Yep. So notice, let me point out here that when I did the example, I went and got the web and the list object and loaded them into context, and then I went and got the list item collection. You don't actually need to do that. You only need to load the objects that you're actually going to work with, right? So he stripped out, he saved one query that I was making, one round trip to the server, by simply saying, I don't need this other stuff. All I need is my list item, my list collection of items, so let me just get that instead, right? So I'm not incurring all that overhead.
And what you need to be thinking about is what's the page payload likely to be? How much resource am I hogging by doing this, and really trying to limit it to as small a thing as possible. Okay, so we need a couple of callback handlers for this. So on success and on failure, because it's obviously not going to, because it's asynchronous, it's not going to return to this thread. So let's...
It never fails, does it?
It does sometimes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it has been known. I also can't type today. But again, I've got the excuse.
That excuse is wearing thin, pal.
Yeah. Right, so on success. So that's got an object sender, and the client request. Client request succeeded event args. There we go. Nice snappy title. So I'll just cut and paste that for the on failure. Now the other interesting thing, so what will happen is when that comes back from the server, this will come in, right? Okay, so that's a failure. Event
Failed.
Is that a reference to the demo?
We don't know. You haven't hit F5 yet.
Okay, so when the request comes back, it's going to go into the on success every time. Absolutely. Okay, so one of the interesting things about developing Silverlight applications like this is you actually need to tell Silverlight that something's changed and it needs to update the UI. So for that, what we need is a delegate control. What am I going to call it? Update UI method. What's the syntax for that? Yeah, no, that's right. Okay, so we've got a delegate there. So now we can say update UI method equals display info. Display info. That's all right.
You haven't created it yet, have you?
No, I know. I'm missing a using statement. All right, so we need a using system.windows.browser, because otherwise that's not in scope. Gotta love it. Okay, so there's my, that should catch up now. That will catch up. So this dot dispatcher dot begin invoke with my update UI. I'm still missing a, or is that not? We'll come back to that. This is not going to compile like this.
Told ya.
Yeah. It'll work. I'll work it out. Okay, so that's why it's not going to display, because I haven't actually created it yet. You're quite right. Right, there's my display info. So this is my delegate that's going to actually do the work. So what I can say is, for each list item in list item data, because I've made that a class scope variable, that's going to be filled in with the data as it comes back in. So I can say, is it text box 1? Text block, again. So text block 1, and I'll just do a really simple string format on that to give the idea. So I'll say new line. And then get some data from that. So what data do I want? I want something like the URL would be useful. So I'm going to get the field values, and I'm going to get the file ref. But obviously, I could get anything that's returned from my camel query there. I can get that value. Missing.
Text block 1.text.
Yep. Thank you. There we go. Right. What are the chances? No.
Aha.
Ah. Well, that was easy. Easy to fix anyway. Right, so that's going to spin up my demo ASP.NET application. There we go.
There they are.
So it's got 5, so my row limit worked as well. So there we go. That's a quick demo of a really pretty Silverlight application. That's
You're on the JavaScript.
I am.
Yeah, I don't have it.
Yeah, I know, but you've got the
There's no
deck.
more slides.
Are there no more slides?
No,
Okay,
we're done.
we're done. Excellent. Right,
They don't like slides anyway, right?
Yeah. Okay, so it's worth just showing, I haven't got this as a working demo on this particular build, but it's worth showing some of the capabilities in Silverlight as well, in the JavaScript model as well. So, just as you'd expect, there is somewhere. There it is. Yep. So there's a function, update story item, where we're loading up the context in the same way that we did in both of the other examples, and then we're executing an asynchronous query and creating delegates to deal with what happens when that comes back. And then in order to set that all up, we've got a context being set, and we're getting the current context in this case. Though, if we wanted to run this on a different server, we would be able to do that too. And then we're loading up this site, and we're getting the lists from the current site.
Notice that scroll back a little bit. Notice that the namespaces are a little bit different on these methods, right?
Yeah.
Instead of get lists, right, or get list by title or whatever, we've got the get underscore list, more of a JavaScript type of syntax. So some of these things are going to trip you up as you move back and forth. So just remember that you've got a little bit of change in the syntax, but I think we've got IntelliSense for that.
We do,
Don't we?
yeah. So if you're building this in Visual Studio, you've got the IntelliSense there for that. One of the great new things in Visual Studio.
Good stuff.
Good.
Right.
Excellent.
So like I mentioned at the outset, this was just a quick overview of the client object model and the different ways that you can work with it in the .NET in Silverlight, building our beautiful applications as you saw us build with lots of pretty colors and spinning icons and fancy stuff. And then doing it also in JavaScript. I think a lot of payoff is going to come in the JavaScript area where we're writing a lot of jQuery stuff and dynamic applications that are doing client-side stuff through Ajax. So I think there's going to be a big payoff here from doing that stuff. But don't discount doing the client OM stuff for WinForm type applications and whatnot as well. It's pretty handy. So if you got any questions, we're just a couple minutes early. If you got some questions, we'll hang around for a few minutes. You can come up and ask us whatever you want. Send us an email if you think of something later that you want to get. We'll be around tomorrow as well, so just hit us up if you have anything. Thank you all for coming. Much appreciated.
Thank you.